right. We have one more panel to go before lunch. And before we start, we want to comment just a little bit for some of you in the audience about the film.
Yeah.
Ready?
Yeah, no, thank you, Laura. And thank you, everyone, for this beautiful conference. This is our third year, and it feels like each year we are centering the voice of survivors, community impacted, formers, people who are in this field, researchers, and really growing. But within that growth, it takes a lot of discomfort, and it takes us challenging ourselves. And within that challenge, as we saw in the film, there's heaviness. So just make sure that you're taking care of yourself, your heart. Take a break every once in a while, and just come back and hopefully, within the film, it showed us that there's a lot of things that can start tragically, but it takes our human spirit and human will to be resilient and courageous and come back to ourselves.
So thank you. And thank you to those of you in the audience who deeply understood a lot of what you were watching and had the courage to watch it and to come back into the room and to be here with us. So thank you. Pardeep, I know your story and I know why that was so profound for you, what we just watched. So could you give us a little bit of a background about how your journey to this place originally began?
Sure. So our journey, I'm not going to go back to complete, but we came to this country when I was 6 years old, and the entire time felt like a struggle to really find our way. And I saw my mom and dad struggle, but never lose sight of just being grateful for the opportunity to be here. And on August 5th, 2012, a white supremacist gunman told us through his actions and his violence that people like us were not allowed this American dream. And in the aftermath of that, there was community that gathered and a community that continues to gather. But within our own personal community, the Sikh community, we had to make a decision. And that decision was, do we stand true to our beliefs and who we are? And for Sikhs, we believe in, the first and foremost thing that we believe in is connection and oneness, and to see that oneness in everyone. And this journey back to that place of oneness took a long time. And I still think that this journey continues. And I see, young Sikhs who are championing some of these causes. Jaydeep, Navdeep from Saldef, and other folks who are here just embody what it means to be a Sikh and to be fighting to eradicate hate. But for us, in that personal journey, started with our own healing and our own community healing. And so that was kind of the aftermath of what happened on August 5th. And within that healing, sometimes that comes from very unlikely sources. Within that healing, I discovered and I saw somebody that was doing some of the same work that we were doing, but in a different way. And he was shedding light on why people who are hurting hurt other people. And as I saw that happening, I wanted to reach out and say, for one, I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to say thank you for doing that work in a different way. So we all kind of work in allyship with one another, or alliance. And as I reached out to him, I also discovered that within our own Sangat, our community, there was a lot of people who were wrestling with fear. I saw a lot of kids who would in Punjabi say, why do white people hate us? Do they all hate us? And there's a lot of days that I struggle with fear in my life, and for all of you that are kind of married, when we get married, we struggle with just the fear of that. When we have children, we struggle with the fear of that. But also that same day that I walked into the temple, struggled with the fear of if these kids are so struggling with their own fear, Will they be the next nurse? Will they be the next police officer? Will they be the next doctor? And my reaching out to Arno was inspired by my gratitude, was inspired by just my belief that, you know, we can heal, but it was also inspired by those kids that were inside the temple at that time to say, what is forgiveness going to look like going forward? And how do we become free of what happened to us and define ourselves by not what happened to us, but by what we've done with it? And
I love that we're talking about fear, and we're also talking about gratitude and forgiveness. I know from my experience that, like, fear is a prerequisite to hate. It's really difficult to hate someone or something if you're not scared out of your mind, like, every day. And as a former white nationalist, I remember my time in the movement, as we called it, was spent always cultivating fear. What are we terrified of today? What can we be terrified? If there's no one to see in person that we're terrified of, we'll, like, find things, nebulous things in the world to be terrified of. And gratitude, forgiveness, kindness, compassion, these things are like the kryptonite to fear. It's hard to be terrified if you're grateful. It's hard to be terrified if you're forgiving people and if you're demonstrating kindness to people who don't deserve it. And that's really the most devastating blow we can deal to hate. If we're going to talk about how to eradicate hate, I think demonstrating that the fear people may have of others who don't look like them or think like them or worship like them, if we can demonstrate that that fear is unfounded, it's a really powerful thing. And I loved how Josh's film really embodied that. You saw how the prospective shooters, like, fear just diminished, and as the fear diminished, so did the hatred.
Tell us, Arno, how did you originally come into the movement? What was that progression for you?
The progression?
For you into extremism.
So I'm what we call a former in this space. Pardeep and I were talking just last night, like, it's important to have language to describe who's who and who's doing what and where we came from. But at the same time, like, we don't want to get bogged down with those labels of former and survivor. But as a former violent extremist working in counter-violent extremism since 2010, I've met formers of every stripe you can imagine. One of my dearest friends is a self-proclaimed former Muslim supremacist. I work with a lot of other former white nationalists. I have a buddy in Denmark who's a former Antifa. Him and I would have killed each other 30 years ago. And among all these formers, you listen to their stories and you hear a lot of adverse childhood experiences, as people like Pardeep, who have letters after their name, call it. In my case, if you were just at a casual glance of my childhood, you wouldn't have seen any ACEs. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. I never went hungry. I never took a beating. My parents were together. They both loved me very much. But under the surface of that, my father's alcoholism made life really difficult for my mother. And not in the sense that he was abusive, but just in the sense that he did more drinking than working. And it was left on mom to sometimes work 2 jobs to keep the lights on and the bills paid in the nice house in a nice neighborhood. And as I grew up seeing my mother suffer, it hurt me. And everything I do now is kind of like Monday morning psychoanalysis. I'm looking back on my life and being like, why did I do that? What went wrong here? And I try to get some, like, mental health chops from Pardeep via osmosis. And I wasn't aware at the time, but I think as a child, seeing my mother suffer hurt me. And as all this praise was heaped upon me, which it was, everybody was like, he's so wonderful, he's so gifted, he can do anything. And that's not bad in itself, but as I was suffering, I just kind of said, no, I'm not wonderful. I'm horrible. And if you don't believe me, watch what I do to this kid on the school bus. Watch what I do to this classroom. Watch what I do to this society. And as I grew older, I developed a habit for antisocial behavior. A lot of the work that we do in Parents for Peace right now is based on the idea of looking at hate as an addiction, the same way we look at it as an addiction to drugs and alcohol. I'm an alcoholic, so I can speak from experience on that. The first time I started drinking, I was 14 years old. I had 4 or 5 beers and I passed out. When I quit drinking at age 34, I could drink 18 beers and still function the next day. So it's an illustration of the nature of substance abuse, where the amount of substance that gets you high the first time doesn't get you high 10 times later, so you have to keep escalating your intake of the substance. My antisocial behavior was the same way. I went from bullying on the school bus to fights in the schoolyard, breaking and entering, vandalism, alcohol when I was 14. By the time I was 16, I'm a full-blown alcoholic already. I had a genetic predisposition for it. I was very familiar with violence. I had been violent since I was a little kid, and hate was just another part of the rush. And that's when I was exposed to white nationalism through white power skinhead music.
And Pardeep, you said you reached out to Arno. Tell us about that initial outreach, and then Arno, I'm going to ask you how you took it from your side.
Yeah, so I reached out through a mutual contact, Ross Furnett, who was originally with Against Violent Extremism, and I asked him, I said, hey, there's this skinhead, or former skinhead in town.
The former part's important.
The former part is important. So former skinhead in town, can you connect me with him? And Ross was like, well, I can give you his email. And so we emailed, then we spoke to each other, and I was kind of trying to figure out Arno. I'm like, is he still a white supremacist? Is he not? Can racists really change? Can they not? If once a racist, always a racist. These are things that we struggle with, right? We all have stereotypes. We all have biases. We all think these things. So it's okay for us to kind of voice it and say, hey, this is what I thought. But then we spoke on the phone, and then I was kind of feeling him out. I'm like, hey, let's just meet out at a restaurant and talk. And what he said to me gave me a little bit of relief, right? I'm Indian, I like spicy food, right? Kind of stereotype. And so I always deem it that white people cannot handle spicy food. I know y'all can, right? So when he said, let's go meet out at a Thai restaurant, it gave me a little bit of relief, right? Because I'm like, he's still not a white supremacist. Otherwise, he couldn't handle spicy food. So we made it that day, and outside of the restaurant, I remember this like it was yesterday. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is October. This is about 3 months after the shooting happened, that I'm going to meet a guy that was part of the same organization that the shooter belonged to in our situation. That was one of the founding members of the Milwaukee chapter. I knew all this. And as I started to tell people about what I was doing, loved ones, they would say things like, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. This is the trauma. You're going through something, right? And I agree. Lots of times when people go through something, there's things that don't seem normal to everybody else. But this is when faith comes in, and you start to listen to something that's a little bit different from all of the chatter that everybody else is kind of giving you. So once he said a Thai restaurant, we met there. We're outside of the restaurant, October, a rainy night. I watched Arno walk by me. And at that time, we were younger men. We were much thinner at that time. And I saw him with a hoodie on. And Milwaukee gets a little bit chilly at that time. So I walked with a hoodie on, kind of walking. And what I remember is, like, he looks like a big old Neanderthal. No, you don't really. But
Neanderthals are better looking.
Yeah, so I was wrestling with all of these thoughts. And as I was kind of like, should I do this? Should I not? I'm wrestling with everybody telling me, there's something wrong with you. I start to put my car into drive, and I was going to make up that old excuse that we all make up. At that time, I had 3 children, and I was going to say, hey, Arno, dude, sorry, man, like one of the kids got sick, right? And there's always ways that we can get out of something and not do it. But then there was something else. There was this push, and this push said, you come this far. Have the courage just to go a little bit further. One more step. And as I took that step out of the car, I went to go meet him inside the restaurant. I saw him inside those glass doors, And another sort of thought came to my mind was, why is he waiting? So Arnold was waiting right at the front of the restaurant. And I was like, that's strange. He's waiting right at the front of the restaurant. And he was flanked by 2 Asian waitresses. And the thought that came to my mind, just kind of, not that we think some of these thoughts, but was like, he didn't eat the 2 Asian waitresses. So I was relieved at that. I'm like, he didn't eat the 2 Asian waitresses. And at this moment, right, there was a part of me that was wrestling with, this person is a monster. This person is not human. He's a Neanderthal. I'm scared. I'm worried. I don't know what's going to happen. I think I've lost my damn mind. And as I walk in and I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to say to him? What is he going to say to me? What am I even doing here? Right? He looks at me and he says, dude, what happened to your eye? And I was like, word, what happened to my eye? All these other things are happening. What happened to my eye? And a week before that, I was giving my little daughter a bath. And on the corner of our bathtub, there's this like shower rod and loofah hook thing. And this loofah hook thing looks like a kind of a wire. And the week before I met Arno, that part went through my eye because I was trying to like soap her down without looking at her. Crazy story, I'll spare you the details. But within the dynamic of that hook lacerated my blinky muscle here. And all your eyelids right now, you have something called a blinky muscle. That's not the...
That's the technical term?
That's the technical term. Yeah. Yeah, in my spare time, I'm a PhD. So that's the technical term, the blinky muscle. And my blinky muscle got lacerated. And when it got lacerated, the only way to keep your eye up, obviously, is to tape it up. So I would scotch tape my eye up everywhere so in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I would walk around with a scotch tape up eye, but then what happens? When you scotch tape your eye up, there's no way, your bottom one does not have the blinky muscle. So I would walk around town going like this. And people were like, okay, like, it looks kind of crazy. So when I walked in and I tell Arnold, here's what happened, and I went into detail of what happened, and I can see him wincing, and I can see him like, oh my God, oh, okay, don't tell me that part, there's too much. I could see somebody that I thought was representative of all these things, empathizing, right? And we sat down and we talked about all the other things that we were going to talk about. We talked about our fathers, we talked about our daughters, we talked about all of that for 3 hours. But it all started from a place of empathy and built to trust. And Arnold raised his hand and said, you know what? Going forward, we're not just doing this work together, we're brothers. So today, a lot of people are like, your relationship is strange. My daughter calls him Uncle Arno. My boys call him Uncle Arno. They get upset when people call him a former white supremacist. They don't know that part, right? They're learning that part now. He just got married. I was his best man. We hang out with each other all the time, right? It's a genuine friendship. We don't just do this for work, but a lot of people get caught up in, this is so strange. And I'm like, should it be? Why? Why is this so strange? And we want to make it more normal.
I think it's a great question to ask ourselves, like, what are we going to normalize? I've learned so much from Pardeep. I'm a Buddhist, but I tattoo Sikhi stuff on me because I'm so inspired by the teachings of Guru Nanak and all the other gurus. And of all those teachings, I think of many often, but thinking of the truth that we are one is, to me, like, that's what we need to normalize. We need to normalize that we are all human beings. We have so much more in common than different. And at the same time, every single one of us is a unique individual with divinity within us. And so we have to kind of navigate that dichotomy and at the same time, like, challenge ourselves to get outside of our comfort zones. Pardeep has taught me that by example and through leadership, it's easy for us as humans to feel kinship with people who look like us, who pray like us, who eat like us, especially who think like us. What's difficult, and this is really where the spiritual rubber hits the road, is when we can see ourselves in others who may not look like us, who may have a different nationality, a different faith. And when we can kind of reach that threshold and then really practice it and normalize it, I think that's how we eradicate hate.
Arno, when you were in the movement, there was something that changed your view, maybe not all at once, but maybe over time. What was it that brought you out of extremism, and what was it that made you take this call?
Well, the simple one-word answer as to how I got out of the movement was exhaustion. It's exhausting to be terrified of all of your fellow humans every waking moment of every day. Talking about Wade Page, the man who killed Pardeep's father and 6 other people, I think to myself, after you kind of let the atrocity of it sink in, you also think that this guy drove himself to such misery by practicing hate and violence every day for 14 years that he felt there was no alternative to homicide followed by suicide. When you practice hate and violence, things like love and gratitude and kindness and compassion and forgiveness, all like the noble qualities of human existence that really make it a special thing, are not just unfamiliar to you, they're terrifying to you. And when you have to expend all sorts of energy to kind of keep those things at bay because they threaten this card house ideology that you've adopted as your identity. When I first became a neo-Nazi, I knew it was wrong. I knew about the Holocaust. I knew why people were repulsed by swastikas. I didn't care as long as I got that rush of offending people and repulsing people. But I had this inner knowledge of that what I was doing was wrong. And rather than listen to that voice and answer it, I had to spend all sorts of energy suppressing it. So that was a big source of exhaustion. Another source of exhaustion was that I had cut myself off from the pop culture in our world that we all take for granted. I grew up a huge sports, film, music, TV geek. I still am all those things. And there were all sorts of elements of pop culture that were forbidden by white nationalist ideology that I had to like sneak around to take in. In the early 90s is when the sitcom Seinfeld came out. And my skinhead girlfriend, who was getting burnt out in white nationalism, just wanted to be like a normal person. She had a job at a bar, was like exposed to Seinfeld at this bar. And she came home and she's like, you gotta watch this show. And as soon as she even just mentioned the name, I'm like, rah, Jews. And she's like, no, you just trust me. And she went on a limb by doing this. But I did trust her and I watched it, and after one show, I was just in love with it. And I had to tape it for her when she went to work on Thursday nights. And I couldn't write Seinfeld on the spine of the tape, so we put it on a tape that said Amber's second birthday party. Because we knew no one would ask to watch that. That's really, we like hid our Seinfeld episodes on the bookshelf. Had my guys come over and seen a tape that said Seinfeld, it would have been violence. Like I would have been a complicit in the destruction of my race by watching a sitcom. The ridiculous nature of that was exhausting. But also the nature of Seinfeld, like added to the exhaustion in that it was observational humor. So I'd watch the show on Thursday night, I love it. Saturday I'm having a bowl of soup, and I'm like, oh, the soup Nazi. Or, you know, Sunday somebody's talking too close to me, oh, it's a close talker. Like one of the infinite numbers of Seinfeld references that come up every single day would give me a chuckle and a moment of joy. And then that same inner voice that challenged what I was doing earlier would ask me, well, does Jerry Seinfeld get to live in your whiter and brighter world? If he does, you think he's going to be very funny if you're killing all the other Jews? And the only legitimate answer to that is that everything I believed was nonsense. The humor of this brilliant sitcom poked all sorts of holes in this very fragile ideology that I was trying to adopt as my identity again. But what the most pressing exhaustion stemmed from was when people I claimed to hate treated me with kindness. And I was very fortunate that throughout the 7 years I was involved in white nationalism, there were people like a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, Afro-American and Latino coworkers who treated me with kindness when I least deserved it, but when I needed it most. And in doing so, they put themselves in a position of power. I can totally understand how someone who's been a target of hate would say, like, I'm done with kindness. I'm done with forgiveness. We've tried that. Didn't work. I totally get that. And it breaks my heart that people have been so traumatized that they feel that way. But the fact is that kindness, compassion, gratitude, forgiveness, they're weapons. They're weapons against hate. And when somebody wields those weapons with authenticity, it has the power to force people to question these hateful ideologies that they adhere to. It creates a sense of cognitive dissonance where, like, hey, this isn't working. I'm trying to hate this person and they're being kind to me. Like, this doesn't compute. And that was the biggest source of my exhaustion. That brought me to a point where after 7 years, I was literally looking for an excuse to leave. In 1994, my girlfriend and I broke up. Go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a healthy relationship between a man and a woman. I found myself a single parent to our 18-month-old daughter. A couple months after that, after a concert my band had played, a second friend of mine was murdered in a street fight. And by that point, I had lost count of how many friends had been incarcerated. It finally hit me that if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. But I truly believe, were it not for all of those exhaustion points falling into place, from The Little Voice to Seinfeld to watching Packer games to my coworkers and my boss and my supervisor treating me with kindness, I really would be remiss to neglect to say my parents loved me throughout when I was at my worst, my mom and my dad, and they were a huge factor in my turnaround. If any one of those things were missing, I may have gone the opposite direction when that second friend was murdered. It's a but for the grace of God, go I type of thing. And every day now, I'm literally feeling joy and gratitude to no longer be terrified of my fellow human beings, to no longer be burdened with this yoke of hate, and also like such deep gratitude to be of service to people like my brother Pardeep and other people who have been targets of hate. Anything I can do to be a part of their healing process is the greatest gift that I could ask for.
And the work that you and Pardeep and Parents for Peace and other organizations are doing now in the room are part of that healing. We talked earlier about how do we find ways to communicate with people who are feeling the way you did, are experiencing life the way you did when you were descending into extremism. Pardeep, let me start with you. What are the things that you have found are effective in communicating with people who you find in that world to help them come out of that world, and, because it's, I think, a separate question, how to reintegrate with this world? And you have, as Arno says, you have a lot of letters after your name, but of the conversations that you have with people, can people in this audience have those conversations as well?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Laura. So Arno and I have been able to share our story with so many people over the past sort of almost 12 years. Not in Our Town has done phenomenal work with students, with communities, documenting the journey and really empowering communities. Parents for Peace, we're honored to work with and be able to help with what intervention looks like and help coach families who are usually the first responders and are sensitive and see this and say, how can I help my child? How can I help? So they're definitely, we rely on parents to do all of that work. But to your, we have been able to work with communities and schools. And one of our first talks we did was at a high school. And they had 3 suicides in 1 year. And when we went in, we did not know this story was going to land with them. And at the end of the talk, Arno took one side and I took one side. And we took 20, 30 kids individually who talked to us for a few hours. So each time we would go to an event, we would build in and say, okay, let's process for 2-3 hours after this. And it would be that, and we started to say to each other, wow, like mental health is an issue. We need, like, how do we scale this? How do we scale this for students? How do we scale this for communities? Like, we need to be able to scale this, and some people don't have the resources or the ability to get it. And so how do we do this, like, with our way? Over time, I was able to hear, and before we would get to share this story, people would come and they would bring their kids to these gatherings and say, hey, here's my son and here's what they believe, and then we would have a conversation with them. We didn't even let people know, but we would hear from people all the time. I just heard from somebody in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was at a flower shop picking up flowers, and somehow we got in this conversation, and they were like, oh yeah, Arno did this and helped my kid de-radicalize. My kid was into this, my kid was into that. So before any of this was kind of an industry, we were already doing it. And so it was like and the reason why us as Sikhs wanted to do this was when we saw all those faces, right, and we saw those kids, we didn't want people to feel sorry for us. Yes, and I guess understanding is great, right? But we did not want people to say, oh, those poor Sikhs. Here's what happened. We don't view ourselves that way. We view ourselves with a strength of pride and power. But power needs to be reclaimed. And it needs to be less about thoughts and more about action. And that's what we're doing at the summit, is how do we help reclaim a sense of power? So over time, and by the 10th year, we had helped thousands and thousands and thousands of kids. About 2,000 kids were part of our programming every single year. And we got to a place where Serve to Unite was just known. They had these handprint shirts all over the place. And by the 10th year, we're having our 10th year remembrance. And I remember my daughter coming up to me and saying, Dad, I want to say a spoken word. I want to say a spoken word at the 10th remembrance. Thousands of people are coming into town. This was not just a tragedy for Oak Creek Sikh community. This was a tragedy, and Sikhs know this worldwide. We were hearing from Sikhs worldwide, right? So we had to uplift an entire community worldwide. We were hurt in our most sacred space, right? And she comes up to me and she says, I want to deliver a spoken word. And now I've helped all these other kids, but then could you help your own family? Are you there for your own family? And so I'm nervous. And she delivers this spoken word. And at the end of the spoken word, and by the way, she spoke and she said, I want to speak directly to Wade Michael Page, a 16-year-old who was 6 when her grandfather was murdered. We were only 10 minutes away from the temple. Right? My mom survived. So I'm just, by the end of the spoken word, she comes out and lights it on fire and says, you didn't hate us. You hated yourself. And I thought that was such a telling place of where a young girl of color could be and how she had processed that. And I knew at that moment, and as I look around at the young Sikh leaders around, by the way, I had Pardeep Singh Kaleka, who was murdered in Canada. This needs to be investigated. This needs to be investigated as a hate crime. There's been too much of that. But I know that the Sikh leadership, the Sikh future, the Sikh youth were good. And so for us, forgiveness looks different for different people. I can't prescribe it to someone. If someone says, Pardeep, hey, you're the guru of forgiveness. No, I'm not. I just have my own journey. You're the guru of your own forgiveness. But what I can say is it's something that you should give a chance. Right? And for me, forgiveness, for us, forgiveness for Sikhs, forgiveness felt like vengeance and freedom, that we could reclaim a sense of ourselves and our faith and show you all just how strong we are. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for being at the summit. Lord, thank you for this third year has been wonderful. I look around and I see more diversity. I see more faces from different places. This is the world as we want to see it as it goes forward. This is what we should try to embrace and try to cultivate as it goes forward. So for all of that, thank you.
Thank you.
When I think of that question of like, how do we talk to people, one of the greatest examples I've come across, if somebody could say, what do I do, is I would point them to the documentary Refuge, which I was really grateful you guys screened last night. Are we on for tomorrow?
We are. So tomorrow at 10 o'clock in room 406, a film called Refuge. I know some of you saw it last night, which, go ahead, Arno, you can
Excellent.
describe it.
I invite you all to come see Refuge tomorrow at 10 a.m. if you didn't get to catch it last night. It's about a colleague and brother of me and Pardeep's and everybody at Parents for Peace, a guy named Chris Buckley, U.S. Army veteran. Chris is no stranger to eradicate hate. He's been here the past couple of years. This is Chris's story, and talking about how he left the Ku Klux Klan, but more importantly, how he overcame this very bitter hatred of Islam that was really like trauma forged in his soul. And it really happened by Chris connecting with another dear friend of ours, a guy named Haval Kelly. Haval is a Kurdish Muslim refugee. His family came to the States a week after 9/11. He went from washing dishes in a restaurant on the Emory Medical School campus to becoming a cardiologist. And I met Haval while I was working with Chris at the Carter Center in Atlanta. We were both speaking at a conference on Islamophobia. And when Haval told his story, it just blew my mind, like how much he loved this country. I've never met anyone who loves the United States like someone who came here fleeing for their lives and was given refuge. And it moved me to introduce Chris and Haval. The film is about their two kind of intersecting stories and this friendship and brotherhood that they develop, but it's a beautiful answer to your question. And I go back to the time where I first met Chris, and he was just like supremely hostile, doing everything he could to like provoke me to return his hostility. I remember when I was in the movement, everything I did was meant to provoke hostility as well. When people came at me with aggression, when people came at me swinging with physical violence, they were putty in my hands. Whether I got my ass kicked or the other way around, if it devolved to violence, I won. If it devolved to hostility and aggression, I won. When I lost, when hate lost, was when people weaponized compassion, weaponized kindness. So as I was talking to Chris, and part of me really wanted to just beat the snot out of him because I was so angry, I reminded myself that no one ever beat the Nazi out of me. And I know I'm a big gnarly looking dude, but I'm really uncoordinated and I was never really a good fighter, so I got beat up pretty often actually. And it never made me any less hateful or violent. So rather than like give Chris what he wanted, I just listened to him, as difficult as it was. And I kept reminding myself, this behavior is coming from his trauma. Trauma I didn't really understand or know at that point. I later found out that like Chris had adverse childhood experiences to burn that would absolutely break your heart. And again, none of that is an excuse for joining the Ku Klux Klan, but if we understand the trauma that drives people to see that ideology as attractive, we're much better positioned to stop it. And so Refuge does a beautiful job of like illustrating that process. It's available on all Delta flights, as well as Amazon Prime, Apple TV, and Google Play, and Vudu.
And tomorrow.
And tomorrow. And I've seen it, I don't know, 20, 30 times now. I love it more each time. Really, as I'm just in it for like 5 minutes. That's the best part of it. But it illustrates, like, answers that question, how do we talk to people? It's by weaponizing compassion, putting ourselves in a position of power, and that's what I do with Chris. I'm like, I get that you hate me and you hate all these other people. I'm here because your wife is worried about the father of her children. I'm here because there's a better way to live your life. I'm here to help you get there if you want. If you don't want, I'll go away. But by having that gentle power approach, that's what turned Chris from where he was then to where he is now, which is really pretty amazing. Chris is actually like my boss at Parents for Peace. He has seniority for me there as a staffer, and he is our lead white nationalist interventionist. So he now gets people out of hate groups full time, and that happened because of that gentle power, because of compassion, because of kindness and forgiveness.
Thank you both. I think one thing, as a person, many of you know me, and Mark Nordenberg, my co-chair, when he retired, when he stepped down as the chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh, he sent little mugs to some people that said, always believe in the goodness of people. And I do. But at the same time, we have to remember that as beautiful as these gentlemen are in this story, as beautiful as this film is, there was a man who was welcomed into a church in Charleston and welcomed into the prayer circle, and he killed every single one of them. And we here in Pittsburgh have just witnessed a trial that involved some testimony that led us to deeply question whether there is any ability to reach some people. And so, as beautiful as this is, we are also very realistic about the depth of the problem that we face. But as all of you ask what you can do to be part of the solution, we wanted you to meet extraordinary human beings like these two men. They are extraordinary human beings who showed great courage in a rainy parking lot one night to make that connection. And it can be done. And it, for me, and I hope for you, it reinforces that there is hope. And there is work for every single one of us to do, to share our humanity, to understand that we are usually not dealing with monsters. We are dealing with people who have suffered and are looking for belonging, and they have found it in the wrong place. And so with that, please join me in thanking two of my really favorite people, and thank you for being here. Thank you.